2 a.m. Welcome back to the 2 a.m. Book Review Club, where we stay up late talking about books or talk about books that made us stay up late. A couple of months ago, or more than a couple of months ago, by the time this video is finally done, I made a video about the Hunger Games trilogy, and in the process of making that video, I became curious about the origins of the YA/middle grade dystopian genre, because while the popularity of the Hunger Games did kickstart the flood of YA dystopian books that inundated the book world in the 2010s, it also wasn't the first dystopian book to reach mainstream popularity. I'm not here to debate which book did it first, but I think it's hard to argue that the YA/middle grade dystopian book that was most influential for later books like The Hunger Games was Lois Lowry's 1993 book, The Giver. I mean, it's right there in her Wikipedia article. Robin Wasserman, a writer for the New York Times, said, "In many ways, Lowry invented the contemporary young adult dystopian novel." And in a 2021 interview with The New Yorker entitled What Lois Lowry Remembers, the interviewer says, "One dominant YA trend, which you arguably kicked off, is the dystopian fantasy." And Lois Lowry replies, "You're right, the Giver Quartet did elicit a flood of dystopian books, and I've heard from editors that they began to wish that the genre had never been invented, yet they've continued to publish it, and people continued to write it. And some of it, I guess, has been very good." Even beyond its influence on the publishing world, The Giver, with its controversial themes and ideas, continues to elicit, let's say, strong reactions in pretty much everyone. As Wikipedia tells us, in 2020, Time magazine described The Giver as a staple of both middle school curricular and banned book lists. Love it or hate it, The Giver is a book that very much remains in our cultural consciousness. No thanks to the 2012 movie everyone hated, Taylor Swift cameo notwithstanding. But surprisingly, what doesn't seem to be remembered as often is that The Giver is actually the first in a series of 4 books. Book 2, Gathering Blue, was published in 2000. Book 3, Messenger, was published in 2004. And the 4th and final book was published the same year the movie came out, 2012. The Giver will always be iconic, but it's only when you read all 4 books that you can appreciate what a wild ride this series is from start to finish. Shocking deaths, sentient cloth, sentient wood, even a sentient evil forest. A lot of unexpected sentience in this series. We'll get to it. And a final boss who is literally evil incarnate. Speaking of final bosses, there is also a story arc about how if you are a gamer, you are literally destroying democracy. So let's talk about it. What happens in the Giver series, what it means, and why it remains so well known and so controversial even today. And let's begin by going back to where it all started. The book that kick-started this saga, the 1993 breakout middle grade dystopian hit, The Giver. Part 1, the stuff you probably already know. The Giver is set in a community where people's lives follow a structured pattern. At 12, you're assigned a job. As an adult, you apply for a spouse, then for children, then finally you move into the house of the old, where you are taken care of like an oversized baby until the day you are released to elsewhere. It's a community of sameness. Differences are forbidden, and all your life decisions are made by the committee of elders. As a reader, this community is both terrifying and also oddly comforting. You're attracted and repulsed, charmed and repelled. The Giver is a manipulative book that convinces you this is the best of all possible worlds, while also showing you why it would be the worst of all possible worlds. As author Lois Lowry said in her Newbery acceptance speech for The Giver, I tried to make Jonas's world seem familiar, comfortable, and safe, and I tried to seduce the reader. I seduced myself along the way. It did feel good, that world. I got rid of all the things I fear and dislike, all the violence, prejudice, poverty, and injustice. And I even threw in good manners as a way of life, because I liked the idea of it. One child has pointed out in a letter that the people in Jonas's world didn't even have to do dishes. It was very tempting to leave it at that. But I've never been a writer of fairy tales. The Giver opens with our protagonist, Jonas, feeling nervous about his upcoming Ceremony of 12, where he will learn what job he's been assigned. As it turns out, Jonas is right to be nervous because he has been selected as the receiver of memory, a job assignment so unique he doesn't even know what it is. His heart swelled with gratitude and pride, but at the same time, he was filled with fear. He did not know what his selection meant. He did not know what he was to become or what would become of him. Jonas begins his training with the current receiver of memory, who explains that Jonas's job will be to receive memories of the world as it used to be before sameness. Since Jonas will be the new receiver, the receiver tells Jonas to call him the Giver. Hence the title of the book. Jonas has never experienced feelings or weather or pain or anything that can cause even the mildest discomfort. And now he's suddenly receiving memories of sunburn and sleds, Christmas trees and colors, family and famine, poverty and loneliness. Jonas struggles with the pain of these memories, but he struggles even more with the joy, as we see in a conversation Jonas has after receiving a memory of a family celebrating the holidays together. It seems to work pretty well that way, doesn't it? The way we do it in our community? Jonas asked. I just didn't realize there was any other way until I received that memory. It works, the Giver agreed. Jonas hesitated. I certainly like the memory, though. I can see why it's your favorite. I couldn't quite get the word for the whole feeling of it, the feeling that was so strong in the room. Love, the Giver told him. Jonas repeated it. Love. It was a word and concept, new to him. They were both silent for a minute. Then Jonas said, Giver? Yes? Jonas blurted out what he was feeling. I was thinking that, well, I can see that it wasn't a very practical way to live, with the old right there in the same place where maybe they wouldn't be well taken care of the way they are now, and that we have a better arranged way of doing things. But anyway, I was thinking, feeling, actually, that it was kind of nice then, and that I wish we could be that way, and that you could be my grandparent. The family in the memory seemed a little more, he faltered, not able to find the word he wanted. A little more complete, the Giver suggested. Jonas nodded. I like the feeling of love, he confessed. He glanced nervously at the speaker on the wall, reassuring himself that no one was listening. I wish we still had that, he whispered. Of course, he added quickly, I do understand that it wouldn't work very well, and that it's much better to be organized the way we are now. I can see that it was a dangerous way to live. What do you mean? Jonas hesitated. He wasn't certain, really, what he had meant. He could feel that there was risk involved, though he wasn't sure how. Well, he said finally, grasping for an explanation, they had fire right there in that room. There was a fire burning in the fireplace, and there were candles on a table. I can certainly see why those things were outlawed. Still, he said, slowly, almost to himself, I did like the light they made, and the warmth. And there is the core dilemma. Do you take the safety of the community's better arranged, emotionless world, or do you take the light and warmth of love, of real human connections, even if true happiness cannot exist without true pain? Love and war, family and loneliness, satiation and starvation, excess and lack. These are dualities, two sides of the same coin. Consider Jonas's first memory of riding a sled down a snowy hill. His breath was visible beyond, through the swirl of what he now somehow perceived was the thing the old man had spoken of, snow. He could look out and down a great distance. He was up high someplace. The ground was thick with the furry snow, but he sat slightly above it on a hard, flat object. Sled, he knew abruptly. He was sitting on a thing called sled, and the sled itself seemed to be poised at the top of a long, extended mound that rose from the very land where he was. Even as he thought the word mound, his new consciousness told him hill. Then the sled, with Jonas himself upon it, began to move through the snowfall, and he understood instantly that now he was going downhill. No voice made an explanation. The experience explained itself to him. His face cut through the frigid air as he began the descent, moving through the substance called snow on the vehicle called sled, which propelled itself on what he now knew without doubt to be runners. Comprehending all of those things as he sped downward, he was free to enjoy the breathless glee that overwhelmed him, the speed, the clear cold air, the total silence, the feeling of balance and excitement and peace. A snowy sled ride is cold, risky, and understandably overwhelming for a boy who grew up without either weather or altitude. But what he feels isn't fear, it's breathless glee, because his enjoyment derives from the fact that he is going downhill through the snow. The discomfort is integral to Jonas's enjoyment. Enjoyment and discomfort, pain and pleasure, they coexist, often at the same moment in time. The question isn't, would you accept war in order to have love, but rather, can you accept that pleasure will always come with or even derive from pain? The risk Jonas identifies in the memory of the family celebrating the holidays isn't actually the fire or the candles, right? It's the risk you take in forming authentic human connections. There is no one who can bring you more joy than someone you love, but there is also no one who can hurt you more deeply, which is why, thematically, it makes sense that the plot's turning point comes from Jonas's connection to a baby named Gabe. Jonas's father works at the nurturing center where babies, like everyone else, are expected to be happy, obedient, and content. Gabe is happy enough, but he has trouble sleeping through the night. A common issue with babies, but not in this community of sameness where it is such a big deal that Jonas's father brings Gabe home every night for extra attention. Jonas develops a connection to Gabe, a connection that helps him decide that, despite the risks, he prefers the way things used to be. Things could change, Gabe, Jonas went on. Things could be different. I don't know how, but there must be some way for things to be different. There could be colors. And grandparents, he added, staring through the dimness toward the ceiling of his sleeping room. And everybody would have the memories. You know about memories, he whispered, turning toward the crib. Gabriel's breathing was even and deep. Jonas liked hearing him there, though he felt guilty about the secret. Each night, he gave memories to Gabriel. Memories of boat rides and picnics in the sun. Memories of soft rain falling against window panes. Memories of dancing barefoot on a damp lawn. Gabe, the new child, stirred slightly in his sleep. Jonas looked over at him. There could be love, Jonas whispered. But Gabe can only fall asleep when he's with Jonas, which isn't good enough. And so this baby, whose only crime is being unable to sleep, is scheduled for release to elsewhere. Release is both a punishment and also part of the community's life cycle. It's used to get rid of inconvenient babies, but it's also what happens to people once their time in the house of the old is over. The Giver is technically written for kids, but even kids can probably figure out early on that release is actually just euthanasia, and that release to elsewhere is a way to reduce death to a meaningless phrase that has come to be considered a viable solution in cases where it should never be considered a solution, such as when you have a baby who can't sleep through the night. When Jonas learns that Gabe has been scheduled for release, he decides that enough is enough. He needs to escape the community with Gabe, and unsurprisingly, the escape doesn't go to plan. They're chased by community planes, they face hunger and exhaustion, and once they're beyond the community's climate control system, they also have to deal with winter. Eventually, the only thing that keeps Jonas going is the belief that somewhere, somehow, he'll find a place beyond sameness, that he'll find elsewhere. Finally, Jonas and Gabe, hungry, cold, exhausted, almost but not quite dead, find a sled at the top of a snow-covered hill. He settled himself on the sled and hugged Gabe close. The hill was steep, but the snow was powdery and soft, and he knew that this time there would be no ice. No fall, no pain. Inside his freezing body, his heart surged with hope. They started down. Jonas felt himself losing consciousness, and with his whole being, willed himself to stay upright atop the sled, clutching Gabriel, keeping him safe. The runners sliced through the snow, and the wind whipped at his face as they sped in a straight line through an incision that seemed to lead to the final destination, the place that he had always felt was waiting, the elsewhere that held their future and their past. He forced his eyes open as they went downward, sliding, and all at once, he could see lights, and he recognized them now. He knew they were shining through the windows of rooms, that they were the red, blue, and yellow lights that twinkled from trees in places where families created and kept memories, where they celebrated love. Downward, faster and faster. Suddenly, he was aware with certainty and joy that below, ahead, they were waiting for him, and that they were waiting too for the baby. For the first time, he heard something that he knew to be music. He heard people singing behind him across vast distances of space and time. From the place he had left, he thought he heard music too, but perhaps it was only an echo. This ending is iconic because it's not really an ending at all. Has Jonas really found elsewhere? Or is this just a hallucination before he and Gabe freeze to death? In her 1994 Newbery acceptance speech, Lois Lowry tells us about a few of the theories kids have had over the years about what the ending of The Giver really means. From a 6th grader, I think that when they were traveling in a circle. When they came to elsewhere, it was their old community, but they had accepted the memories and all the feelings that go along with it. From another, Jonas was kind of like Jesus, because he took the pain for everyone else in the community so they wouldn't have to suffer. And at the very end of the book, when Jonas and Gabe reached the place that they knew as elsewhere, you described elsewhere as if it were heaven. And one more. A lot of people I know would hate that ending, but not me. I loved it, mainly because I got to make the book happy. I decided they made it. They made it to the past. I decided the past was our world, and the future was their world. It was parallel worlds. But what readers in 1994 didn't know is that eventually we would get definitive answers as to what happened to Jonas and to Gabe, because we eventually got 3 sequels. The books that, let's admit it, we're really here to talk about today. So let's do that. Let's talk about the sequels. Part 2, Post-Apocalyptic Dystopia, Take 2. The Giver sequels are some of the most unsequel-like sequels I have ever read, because they are what I would call conceptual sequels, not narrative sequels. They're not about the characters or the plot, but instead about what a post-apocalyptic society can or should look like. The tagline for the Giver sequels should be, "We live in a society, so what are you going to do about it?" And to show you just how unsequel-like these sequels are, let's compare The Giver, Book 1, with Book 2, Gathering Blue. Gathering Blue opens with our new protagonist, Kira, who is mourning the death of her mother as the book opens. Mother? There was no reply. She hadn't expected one. Her mother had been dead now for 4 days, and Kira could tell that the last of the spirit was drifting away. Mother. She said it again, quietly, to whatever was leaving. She thought she could feel its leave-taking, the way one could feel a small whisper of breeze at night. Now she was all alone. Kira felt the aloneness, the uncertainty, and a great sadness. This had been her mother, the warm and vital woman whose name had been Katrina. Then, after the brief and unexpected sickness, it had become the body of Katrina, still containing the lingering spirit. After 4 sunsets and sunrises, the spirit too was gone. It was simply a body. Diggers would come and sprinkle a layer of soil over the flesh, but even so, it would be eaten by the clawing, hungry creatures that came at night. Then the bones would scatter, rot, and crumble to become part of the earth. Where in The Giver, the existence of death is one of Jonas's biggest revelations, in Gathering Blue, death is present from page 1. Where technology is baked into The Giver's futuristic look and feel, Gathering Blue features an agricultural village where indoor plumbing is a privilege given to only the men in power, and where The Giver is almost aggressively egalitarian. The women in Gathering Blue aren't even allowed to learn how to read. The Giver offers us one vision of a post-apocalyptic future, the kind you can imagine scientists and engineers with more idealism than common sense obsessively planning out. But Gathering Blue features the kind of post-apocalyptic dystopia we would probably actually end up with. Given that these books are part of the same series, there is a kind of implicit question that Gathering Blue is asking you, the reader. Which society would you rather live in? The Giver offers you a life of illusions, a life of enforced happiness and conformity and gratitude, a life without feelings. Gathering Blue offers you a life with no illusions, a life with all of the emotions. But the catch, of course, is that the emotion you're going to be feeling most often is fear. Fear was always a part of life for the people. Because of fear, they made shelter and found food and grew things. For the same reason, weapons were stored, waiting. There was fear of cold, of sickness and hunger. There was fear of beasts, and fear propelled her now as she stood, leaning on her stick. She looked down a last time at the lifeless body that had once contained her mother and considered where to go. Jonas feels fear, of course, but for the most part, his fears are tied to essentially abstract issues, memories, feelings, and what place those things should have in society. But in Gathering Blue, her mother's death exposes Kira to very real fears of where she's going to live and what she's going to do. She has to find a new place to live. She has to find a new way to support herself. And most importantly, she has to deal with her village's extreme prejudice against disabled people. Because as different as The Giver and Gathering Blue seem to be, they're still conceptual sequels, which means they are still connected by the ideas that they share. And Gathering Blue has this interesting tendency to take ideas that were implicit in The Giver and then expand on them. The theme of disability is a really great example of this. In The Giver, differences between people are eradicated in the name of sameness, and it's implied that people with visible differences that can't be ignored, such as disabled people, are not allowed to exist. And in Gathering Blue, we expand on this theme of prejudice against visibly different people, and more specifically disabled people, because in this village, it is literally illegal for disabled people to exist. Since Kira was born with a quote-unquote twisted leg, which is how the book puts it, i.e. she needs a cane in order to walk and can't be on her feet for long periods of time, it's kind of a miracle that Kira's alive at all. No one would desire Kira. No one had, except her mother. Often, Katrina had told Kira the story of her birth, the birth of a fatherless girl with a twisted leg, and how her mother had fought to keep her alive. "They came to take you," Katrina said, whispering the story to her in the evening, in their cot, with the fire fed and glowing. "You were 1 day old, not yet named your one-syllable infant name. Kyr. Yes, that's right, Kyr. They brought me food and were going to take you away to the field." Kira shuddered. It was the way, the custom, and it was the merciful thing to give an unnamed, imperfect infant back in the earth before its spirit had filled it and made it human. But it made her shudder. While her mother's alive, Kira has a defender who insists that Kira's existence is just as valid and valuable as everyone else's. But now, Kira has to face the reality of how everyone else in the village views her, because after her mother's death, she is almost immediately dragged to court by a woman named Vandara over the legality of her very existence. "The accuser will speak first," the chief guardian instructed. Vandara's voice was firm and bitter. "The girl should have been taken to the field when she was born and still nameless. It is the way." "Go on," the chief guardian said. "She was imperfect and fatherless as well. She should not have been kept." "But I was strong, and my eyes were bright. My mother told me she wouldn't let me go." Kira shifted her weight, resting her twisted leg, remembering the story of her birth, and wondering if she would have an opportunity to tell it here. "I gripped her thumb so tightly." "We have all tolerated her presence for these years," Vandara went on, "but she has not contributed. She cannot dig, or weed, or plant, or even tend the domestic beasts the way other girls her age do. She drags that dead leg around like a useless burden. She is slow, and she eats a lot." Sorry, I know it's not funny, but that last line always makes me laugh. Vandara also insinuates that Kira was only kept alive because her grandfather was politically powerful, that her mother possibly died of an infectious disease, that no one will want to marry Kira, that Kira's making the small children less disciplined by playing with them, and finally, even the government has had enough, literally. The chief guardian waved his hand. "Enough," he announced. Vandara is clearly deranged by her hatred for Kira, but unfortunately, the law is on her side, as Kira's appointed court defender, Jameson, acknowledges. Jameson set the papers on the table and picked up a heavy volume bound in green leather. Kira noticed that each of the guardians had an identical volume. "The accuser is correct, that it is the way," Jameson said to the defenders. Kira's kind of shocked. She's like, "Isn't this man supposed to be defending me?" But then something unexpected happens. Turning, though, Jameson was saying, to the third set of amendments, the guardians all turned pages in their books. Even those whose volumes had remained closed now picked them up and looked for the place. "It is clear that exceptions can be made." "Exceptions can be made," one of the guardians repeated, reading the words, his fingers moving on the page. "So we may set aside the assertion that it is the way," Jameson announced with certainty. "It need not always be the way." The guardians are going to make an exception and save Kira's life because, plot twist, Kira is magic. Part 3. Technology versus magic. The Giver is primarily a dystopian book, but it also has a strong component of magical realism. When Jonas receives the memories from the Giver puts his hands on Jonas, visualizes the memory, and then Jonas is able to experience the memory. It's magic. But why is this how the memories are transmitted? Why not just have Jonas watch a recording or read a book? It would be less dramatic, but it would achieve more or less the same purpose. One reason there's magic is because magic is convenient for the plot. Jonas needs to transmit memories to Gabe. That's easy because it's magic. Jonas can't transmit the memories to his friend or his sister. Well, that's because it's magic. But there's also a thematic reason that magic exists in The Giver. The Giver is science fiction, and generally speaking, there are two ways that magic tends to show up in science fiction stories. Most commonly, we get magical phenomena that is actually just very advanced technology. As sci-fi writer Arthur C. Clarke noted in the third of his so-called 3 laws, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So sci-fi magic can occur as a result of technology, but sci-fi magic can also be in opposition to technology as it is in The Giver. In The Giver, technology has become sufficiently advanced that it is basically impossible to defeat. Because how do you defeat technology that can get rid of color, emotions, and even the weather? How do you defeat something that is so all-powerful? The answer is that you can't, unless you have magic. Technology has to follow some kind of internal logic, and if it breaks that internal logic, you need to have some reason for it. A malfunction, an upgrade, a bug, whatever, but the reason needs to exist. Magic, on the other hand, can do basically whatever you want it to do. Magic cannot be affected by technology, only by humans, which gives people back their autonomy and allows them to live freer, better, and more human-centric lives. At its core, The Giver has a very simple message. Feelings are good, and murder is bad. And because it is technology that has eradicated feelings and therefore the ability to recognize that murder is bad, Jonas being magic symbolizes his fundamental opposition to the community. But none of this applies to Gathering Blue, where technology is practically non-existent and definitely not the problem. So why is there magic? And more specifically, why is Kira magic? Jonas's magical power is the ability to give and receive memories. But Kira's magical power is weaving. She is a divinely inspired weaver, and I'm not even exaggerating. When she was much younger, the knowledge had come quite unexpectedly to her, and she recalled the look of amazement on her mother's face as she watched Kira choose and pattern the threads one afternoon with a sudden sureness. "I didn't teach you that," her mother said, laughing with delight and astonishment. "I wouldn't know how." Kira hadn't known how either, not really. It had come about almost magically, as if the threads had spoken to her or sung. And with her magical abilities, Kira creates a sentient piece of cloth that she keeps with her at all times. As far as literary sidekicks go, you really could not ask for a better one than this tiny piece of cloth. It comforts her, makes her more confident, and even warns her when she's in danger. This thing isn't just sentient, it's practically omniscient. As far as the plot goes, Kira's magical ability does matter because it's the reason the government has saved her life. Instead of embroidering just one small square of cloth, the government wants Kira to use her magical abilities to embroider the village singer's robe. Every year, the village hosts a ceremony where everyone gathers to hear the village singer, wearing his special robes and using his special staff, sing the Ruin Song, which is basically the story of how the apocalypse happened and the world fell apart. It was Kira's mother's job to repair the embroidery on the singer's robe, and now that job will be Kira's, but with a twist. "Kira," he said, looking at her, "you will continue your mother's work. You will go beyond her work, actually, since your skill is far greater than hers was. First, you will repair the robe, as your mother always did. Next, you will restore it. Then your true work will begin. You will complete the robe." The robe currently depicts the village's history, but now the government wants her to complete the robe by depicting what the village's future will look like. Kira accepts the job, obviously, because she has no choice, and discovers that it comes with benefits she never would have experienced otherwise. Because in a village where people live in huts made of twigs and survival is always precarious, Kira is put into housing with indoor plumbing, where 3 luxurious meals are delivered to her every day. So, okay, magic is driving the plot forward, but thematically, why does it matter? Why can't Kira just be a very talented weaver? Why does she need to have a magical weaving superpower? And the problem with Gathering Blue, structurally, is that you are asking yourself that question until the very end of the book, because Kira's magical ability is thematically relevant to the story, but that thematic significance doesn't come into play until the very end. Where the Giver is a very tightly written story, both narratively and thematically, Gathering Blue is, by design, more expansive, more meandering, a story that is about the journey rather than the destination. In The Giver, the message is consistent, always the same. Feelings are good and murder is bad. But in Gathering Blue, it takes a while for that central message to develop. And when it does, it's a question, not an answer. How do you decide that your government is bad enough that you have to do something about it? It's a question that's definitely not on the same level as, are feelings good? Yes or no? And it takes Kira the entire book to finally decide that, yes, she's had enough. Because where Jonas thinks that life is perfect until he discovers that the government is actually a bunch of sadistic baby-killing masterminds or something along those lines, Kira was quite literally born disillusioned. When you're almost killed by your government as a newborn, you don't really have any illusions left to lose. She already knows that the existence of disabled people is illegal. She already knows that women aren't allowed to learn how to read or hold governmental positions, and she already knows that she has been personally victimized time and again by the government. So even when we get the big reveal that Kira's father, who she always thought was dead, is actually not dead at all, that he was attacked, blinded, and left for dead, that he only survived because he was rescued by a mysterious group of strangers, and that Kira was deliberately orphaned so that she could be exploited for her magical abilities. Even when we get this big reveal, it's still not a burn everything down moment for Kira as a character, because wow, this messed up society is even more messed up than I thought it was, does not have the same dramatic or emotional impact as wow, I thought my society is perfect, but actually they murder innocent people all the time. There's no definitive moment where Kira decides that she's had enough, because she was born having enough. But what's interesting about The Giver and Gathering Blue is that as different as they are also mirrors of each other. Jonas and Kira start out with opposite feelings towards their respective societies, but for both of them, the turning point is realizing that things don't have to be the way they are now, that things could be different. In The Giver, Jonas does not wake up one day and realize that murder is bad and feelings are good. He is instead disillusioned by being given a blueprint for change. If we just went back to the way things used to be, then all of our current problems would no longer exist. Jonas leaves to escape, yes, but he also leaves because he is searching for a place where feelings still exist and murder is still considered a crime and not a solution. And similarly, in Gathering Blue, Kira's father tells her about the people who rescued him and took him to a place he calls the Village of Healing. They help each other, her father explained simply. We help each other. Those who can see, they guide me. I am never without helping eyes. Those who can't walk, they are carried. Kira unconsciously rubbed her own damaged leg. There is always someone to lean on, he told her, or a pair of strong hands for those who have none. The Village of the Healing has existed for a long time, he explained. Wounded people still come, but now it is beginning to change because children have been there and are growing up. So we have strong, healthy young people among us, and we have others who have found us and stayed because they wanted to share our way of life. Kira was trying to picture it. So it is a village like this one? Much the same. We have gardens, houses, families, but it is much quieter than this village. There is no arguing. People have what they have and help each other. Babies rarely cry. Children are cherished. It's a revelation for Kira that disabled people don't have to be marginalized, that they can be allowed to exist. Jonas dreams about a place where things could be different, but Kira's dad is telling her that not only could things be different, there is an actual place where things are different. All she has to do is decide to go with him to the Village of Healing and they can live happily ever after. Except, of course, that would only be a happy ending for Kira and her father. Because what about all of the disabled babies who will be born in the future? What about all of the women who have to continue living in this oppressive society? What message would Kira and her dad walking off into the sunset send that the giver already didn't? And most importantly, if that's how it ended, then what was the point of Kira having magic in the first place? Gathering Blue does not end, of course, with Kira and her dad walking off into the sunset, because good news, Kira discovers that there is, in fact, a reason that she has magic. The Guardians, with their stern faces, had no creative power, but they had strength and cunning, and they had found a way to steal and harness other people's powers for their own needs. They were forcing the children to describe the future they wanted, not the one that could be. Essentially, Kira realizes that if the government is so bad, if their society is so broken, and if there is another better way for society to function, then she doesn't need to leave at all, because she has magic and she can use her magical creativity to create a new future for the village. Just as the message of the giver is that feelings are good and murder is bad, the basic message of Gathering Blue is that creatively talented people should use their creativity to shape society's future. As far as what that actually means, we never find out, because the book ends with Kira making her decision. All we know is that Kira is going to stay in this terrible village in the hope that someday she will be able to change the way that men treat women, that parents treat their children, and the way that literally everyone treats disabled people. Violence will give way to kindness. Selfishness will give way to caring. And eventually, Kira's work will be done and she can join her father in the village of healing. How will she do this? How long will it take? And how exactly is her weaving going to fundamentally change the society in which she lives? We get no explanation either in Gathering Blue or in the rest of the Giver series, but hey, if your creativity is divinely inspired magic that can create an omniscient sidekick piece of cloth like it's nothing, then maybe you can do anything you put your mind to. Part 4. A Utopia, if you can keep it. For a series most often described as dystopian, it might surprise you to learn that Book 3, Messenger, takes place in a utopia, or at least as close to a utopia as someone who says, "I've never been a writer of fairy tales," is likely to get. Our protagonist this time is Maddie, Kira's sidekick in Book 2. In Gathering Blue, Maddie is called Matt, and he is a child from the Fen, an economically disadvantaged area outside of the village that Kira describes as swampy and disagreeable. Just as Kira is shunned for being disabled, Matt is shunned for being from the Fen. People from the Fen were oddly different, always identifiable by their strange speech and crude manners. They were looked down upon by most people, but not by Kira. She was very fond of Matt. In turn, Matt is very fond of Kira, probably because his home life is, well, unpleasant, as Kira discovers at one point in the book when she ventures into the Fen to find Matt. Kira looked in dismay at the cot's dark interior. A pitcher, overturned on a table, lay in a puddle of some thick liquid through which insects crawled. The tyke at the door picked his nose with one finger, scratched himself with the other hand, and stared at them. His mother coughed wetly and then spat something to the floor. "Do you know where he went?" Kira asked, trying not to show how shocked she felt at the condition of these people. The woman shook her head and coughed again. "Good rid to him," she said. She shoved the tyke to the side and pulled the heavy wooden door closed. Matt's mother is already not winning Mother of the Year, but then the tyke, Matt's little brother, reveals that Matt left because, and I quote, "Our mum, she thrashed Matt so hard he was horrid bloody." So it's not surprising that at the end of Gathering Blue, Matt decides to escape with Kira's father to the Village of Healing, now simply referred to as Village with a capital V. Village is tranquil and idyllic, a contrast to the dystopias featured in The Giver and Gathering Blue. Both The Giver and Gathering Blue feature societies that are broken and must be changed. But Messenger instead features an ideal society, or at least as ideal as you're going to get in a post-apocalyptic world. And so the central narrative question is, how do you keep your society from turning into something you don't want it to be? To paraphrase that one Ben Franklin quote, Messenger is a utopia if you can keep it. Village is built on the principles of acceptance and equality, and the point of the book is that those principles are really difficult to stay true to. Even though Village started out as a refuge for people who have nowhere else to go, now some people in Village are starting to think they've done enough. They've helped enough people, and now they want to focus on themselves. There had been a petition signed by a substantial number of people to close Village to outsiders. There would have to be a debate and a vote. Maddie is confused by this petition, and Kira's dad, now his guardian and primary father figure, tells him that it exists because selfishness is creeping in. Maddie was startled. Village had been created out of the opposite, selflessness. He knew that from his studies and from hearing the history. Everyone did. Ironically, given that Maddie tells us it's his studies and his knowledge of history that taught him the importance of selflessness, its mentor, Village's wise and patient schoolteacher, who is heading both the petition and the opposition to the leader of Village. And the leader of Village is, plot twist, none other than Jonas from The Giver, alive, thriving, and all grown up. He's also living in a house full of books. Maddie enjoyed going to Leader's home place because of the stairs. Others had stairs, though Maddie and the blind man did not. The Leader's stairs were circular, which fascinated Maddie, and he liked going up and down. And because of the books, others had books too. Maddie had a few school books, and he often borrowed other books from the library. But Leader's home place, where he lived alone, had more books than Maddie had ever seen in one place. The entire ground floor, except for the kitchen to one side, was lined with shelves, and the shelves were filled with volumes of every sort. Leader allowed Maddie to lift down and look at any one he wanted. There were stories, of course, not unlike the ones he found in the library. There were history books as well, like those he studied at school, the best ones filled with maps that showed how the world had changed over centuries. Some books had shiny pages that showed paintings of landscapes unlike anything Maddie had ever seen, or of people costumed in odd ways, or of battles, and there were many quiet, painted scenes of a woman holding a newborn child. Still others were written in languages from the past and from other places. Jonas is now the leader of Village, the place that saved him and which he is now trying to save from the people who want to change its fundamental values. And it's a difficult situation because he is committed to helping people who, like him, fled oppressive or cruel societies, but he is also committed to making sure that people's voices are heard. Village is a majority rules democracy, and if the majority of people decide that no new residents should be allowed, then Jonas is not going to overrule their decision. It's an incredibly fine line to walk, as illustrated by this scene where Leader is trying to welcome new arrivals while also dealing with Mentor's protest against said new arrivals. Leader's voice was, as always, calm. He spoke first to the new ones, welcoming them. He would have done this later in the day, after they had been fed and settled. But now, instead of waiting, he reassured them briefly. "We were all of us new ones once," he said, with a smile, "except for the youngsters who have been born here. We know what you have been through. You will no longer be hungry. You will no longer live under unfair rule. You will never be persecuted again. We are honored to have you among us. Welcome to your new home. Welcome to Village." Then Leader turned to those who remained. "Thank you, those of you who came to give welcome. It is one of the most important things we do in Village. Those of you who object, Mentor, you and the others." He looked at the small group of dissenters. "You have that right, as you know. The right to dissent is one of our most important freedoms here. But the meeting is in 4 days. Let me suggest that instead of worrying and frightening these new ones who have just come and are weary and confused, let us wait and see what the meeting decides. Even those of you who want to close Village to new ones, even you value the peace and kindness we have always embraced. Mentor, you seem to be leading this. What do you say?" "Yes," Mentor said to Leader. "We will see what the meeting decides." Look at Jonas, all grown up and being a good leader. But unfortunately for him, the small group of dissenters is becoming larger, and he needs to figure out why before they vote to close Village forever. Part 5. Gamers against democracy. If you play video games, you have probably been told at some point in your life that it's a waste of time. It's rotting your brain, and you should go find a real hobby. You may have even been thrown the classic line about video games causing violence. And all I'll say about that is if you discovered that Kyle Kyleson had been having a workplace emotional affair behind your back with Liberty Lee, of all townies, you'd also be driven to justifiable violence. As you can probably tell, the only video game I really play is The Sims 4, but I understand the struggle. If this sounds familiar, then you'll be delighted to learn that Book 3 of the Giver series, Messenger, says that if you are a gamer, you are literally a threat to democracy and must be stopped. Gamers against democracy. We should have shirts. The only two acceptable hobbies in Village are music and reading, and anything else is probably a waste of time. So, when our protagonist Maddie gets excited over his friend's brand new gaming machine and says that he wants one, the adults in his life are unenthusiastic, and not just unenthusiastic, but also suspicious about where these gaming machines are coming from and what they're doing to the people of Village. As it turns out, the gaming machines are coming from Trademart. Trademart has existed in Village for a long time, and the idea is that if you have something you don't need, you can take it to Trademart and trade it for something you want. Since Village doesn't have a currency or a market economy, it instead uses the most basic form of a barter economy, with Trademark acting as the barter market. Trademark has always been straightforward, but now there's a mysterious guy named Trademaster who can offer you things that you can't get any other way, such as gaming machines, all for the low price of your deepest self. If you just hand over your values, your principles, your beliefs, and everything that makes you what you are, then you too can become a gamer. Basically, people have become corrupted by their material desires, and in turn, they are corrupting this ideal little village because, Messenger argues, a democratic utopia is fundamentally incompatible with materialism. Materialism makes you value yourself and your possessions over your ethical values. And what happens to a utopia without a strong belief in ethical values? It becomes a degenerate society of selfish gamers. But what are the ethical values we're talking about here? Is it really so wrong for people to want more than the bare necessities of life? Is it really so wrong to want to become a gamer? At this point, we are about to launch our big discussion about the ethics of materialism and the consumer society, and I do want to clear up a couple of important issues before we do that. One, I am a gamer, even if I only play The Sims 4 and similarly low-stakes slice-of-life type games. Two, I make YouTube videos, which means that not only am I a material girl, but I also actively contribute to the consumer society, and I am aware of that. Three, I'm only engaging in this discussion for the purposes of literary analysis, because fundamentally, I am just a person who talks about books and reads books and writes books. I am not an expert on ethics or economics, nor am I pretending to be. And therefore, in order to facilitate our discussion, I've pulled two contrasting essays on this subject. Essay number one is the late philosophy professor John Arthur's 1996 essay, Famine Relief and the Ideal Moral Code, and this essay was written in response to essay number two, Peter Singer's 1972 essay, Famine, Affluence, and Morality, which was first published in the journal Philosophy and Public Affairs. The viewpoints I'm about to discuss are not my own. They are included only for the sake of literary analysis, and you are welcome, of course, to argue about these viewpoints in the comments if you have strong feelings on the subject, but I will not be engaging because, again, I am a book person. I am a bookish person and not an expert in any way on ethics or economics. So, is it wrong for the people in Village to want more than the necessities of life? Is it wrong for them to want gaming machines? Jonas says yes, it is wrong. Mentor says no, it's not wrong, and I'm going to begin with Mentor's viewpoint. In the essay, Famine Relief and the Ideal Moral Code, John Arthur explores the question of whether or not we have a moral obligation to contribute as much as possible to alleviate the suffering of others. We, meaning us, the people alive right now watching this video, making this video in my case, live in a pre-apocalyptic world where there is both famine and excess, where some people literally starve to death while others have more than enough to eat? Do the people who have more than enough? In Arthur's argument, he's specifically talking about people living in the United States. Do these people have a moral duty to help the people who don't have enough? And in this case, again, he is talking about people outside of the United States, and more specifically, people in developing countries. If you, as an individual, can survive on, for example, half of your income, should you be morally obligated to give away the other half to people who need it more? Arthur's answer is no, and he begins with a discussion of the ideal moral code that American society should be obligated to live by. What would the ideal moral code be? Would it include a moral duty to help others? And if so, what would the extent of that moral obligation be? Arthur's argument has 3 basic points. Point 1, any ideal moral code has to be universal. Everybody has to follow it, which means that, in Arthur's words, an ideal moral code must not only be one that can hope to win public support, but must be practical and workable in other important ways as well. The ideal code is one that works for people as they are, or at least can be encouraged to become. Point 2, the ideal moral code can't be too ideal. Rules that would work only for angels are not the ideal ones for a society of human beings. While we do care about others' well-being, especially those we love, we also care very deeply about ourselves. It would therefore be quite difficult to get people to accept a code that requires that they give away their savings or duplicate organs to a stranger simply because doing so would avoid even more evil. Many people simply wouldn't do that as that rule required. They cared too deeply about their own lives and welfare, as well as the welfare of loved ones. Essentially, what he's trying to say is that there is no point in having a universal moral code if nobody is going to follow it. And point 3, society just functions better if people are allowed to decide how they want to spend their extra resources. Suppose, to make it vivid, that the tax system enforces the greater moral evil rule, taking away all income that could be used to prevent a greater evils befalling somebody else. The result would be less work done, less total production of useful commodities, and therefore a general reduction in people's well-being. This leads us to Arthur's conclusion. A more modest proposal would require people to help strangers when there is no substantial cost to themselves. That is, when what they are sacrificing would not mean significant reduction in their own or their family's level of happiness. Since most people's savings accounts and nearly everyone's second kidney are not insignificant, entitlements in those cases would, outweigh another's need. But if what is at stake is truly trivial, as dirtying one's clothes would normally be, then an ideal moral code would not allow rights to override the greater evil that can be prevented. To paraphrase what Arthur is saying, yes, people should contribute more to the well-being of others, but no, people should not always be required to do the most that they possibly can to help others. If the sacrifice required is trivial, then you should be required to make it. If the sacrifice required is not trivial, such as giving away your kidney, then you should not be required to make it. In the context of Messenger, John Arthur would probably argue that Mentor is not inherently wrong for wanting to spend his extra resources on, for example, a gaming machine, because it is unreasonable to expect people to always put others first. Arthur would probably say that Jonas is looking in the wrong place for answers and that gamers are not to blame for corrupting democracy. Now, the problem with Arthur's argument is that it only works for American society as it was in 1996, the year he wrote this essay. 20th century, and indeed 21st century America, was and is a market economy that operates off of money that we earn by working jobs and which we then give back to the economy to support everyone else's jobs. That's why Arthur is so focused on motivating people to work harder and produce more goods and services, because otherwise, from his perspective anyway, everyone will be worse off. But if we look at Messenger, that's not how this society operates. Village functions off of willing collaboration. People work together to gather or create resources, and then those resources are distributed according to need. The barter economy only exists because people are willing to trade for things they want but don't actually need. Arthur argues that American society has an existing moral code where people are entitled to what they earn and are not morally required to give their resources away to anyone. And his ideal moral code, with its emphasis on practicality, might not be a great deal different from our own. But Messenger's village has a very different and much stricter moral code than either 20th or 21st century America, as we can see if we revisit Arthur's argument in the context of Messenger. Point 1, if there's going to be an ideal moral code at all, then it has to be universal. In the case of Messenger, that ideal moral code is the foundation of Village. Village only exists because the founders wanted to build a society where better, more enlightened moral values were baked into the foundations. So there's no question of if there's going to be an ideal moral code, because the ideal moral code exists even before Village really does. I mean, Jonas is the leader of Village, and he formulated his basic moral code of feelings are good and murder is bad long before he ever found Village. Point 2, the ideal moral code can't be too ideal because there's no point in having a universal moral code if nobody is going to follow it. Again, this doesn't apply because Village is made up of people who have survived broken or corrupt moral codes and presumably learned their lesson. Please note that this is the book's assumption and not my assumption, because history has clearly shown that just because you were poorly treated in the past, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to treat others better once the balance of power has swung in your favor. But this isn't real life. This is a book featuring a working utopia, so clearly Messenger is some flavor of fantasy. Point 3, society functions better if people are allowed to decide how they want to spend their extra resources. Again, not how Village functions, because Village has no concept of being entitled to the product of your labor. If you catch a fish or make a piece of clothing, you have no right to keep it, which means that you have no real personal incentive to work harder, just the moral incentive of having made Village a happier and more productive place overall. The key here is context, right? John Arthur's argument doesn't work for Messenger's Village because it is specifically tailored to 20th century America. To quote Peter Singer's opposing essay, Famine, Affluence, and Morality, moral attitudes are shaped by the needs of society. And what are the needs of villages society? They don't have an economy, much less a market economy, so they don't need to increase their GDP or whatever. In most societies, moral codes are an artifact created after the fact. But Messenger's village is a society built around an ideal moral code. Arthur is talking about creating a moral code that will work with an already existing society. But in Messenger, we are talking about a society that needs to uphold a moral code that already exists. Now, let's address Jonas's argument against materialism, his anti-gamer position. In Famine, Affluence, and Morality, Singer argues that because we exist in a world with so much inequality, it is your moral duty to contribute as much as you can to ease the suffering of others. And I want to highlight this point in particular. If we accept any principle of impartiality, universalizability, equality, or whatever, we cannot discriminate against someone merely because he is far away from us or we are far away from him. Basically, he's saying that we have an equal moral duty to help people who are outside our society as we do to help people who are inside our society. And if we look at Messenger's village, this principle is a cornerstone of their society. The people of village think that it is their duty to not just take in refugees from oppressive societies, but also to literally go to more oppressive societies and save people. That's how Kira's father survived his horrific attack. People carried him from Gathering Blue's village, the one with the lowercase v, all the way to Messenger's village, the one with the uppercase V. In Village's ideal moral code, helping people trapped in repressive or dystopian societies, people outside their own society would be principle number one. So, in the context of Village, a utopian island in a sea of post-apocalyptic dystopias and chaos, it makes sense that materialism would be considered a fundamental threat to their democracy. As Singer would say, it should be clear that we would have to give away enough to ensure that the consumer society, dependent as it is on people spending on trivia rather than giving to famine relief, would slow down and perhaps disappear entirely. There is no doubt that the consumer society has had a distorting effect on the goals and purposes of its members. I've mentioned that I play The Sims 4, and if you looked up the definition of spending on trivia, you would probably find paying actual money for Sims 4 packs and kits just so I can get pretty clothes and furniture. The rational part of my brain knows that. But the Gen Z part of my brain that is always looking for that next dopamine hit sees a new pack or kit and decides to buy it anyway. We don't just live in a society. We live in a consumer society, and breaking out of the cycle of buying stuff, getting bored, and buying more stuff is something that most of us are never going to be able to do as long as we have the money to participate in this cycle. But in Messenger, the virtual material wonderland where all of us material girls get to play all day has been destroyed. Jonas and his friends have built a new society from the ground up, and they are determined to make sure that the consumer society never gets a chance to start its toxic cycle in the first place. And if that means that gaming machines and gamers have to be the face of everything that undermines democracy and the ideal moral code, well, then EA, you know what you did. Part 6. Save the children. You know, children really don't have it easy in the Giver series, where most kids' books like to pretend that your problems only start once you grow up. The Giver books shine a spotlight on how hard being a kid can be. Consider this scene from The Giver where the chief elder is handing out job assignments at Jonas's ceremony of 12, and then she gets to Jonas's friend, Asher. At the meeting where Asher was discussed, we retold many of the stories that we all remembered from his days of language acquisition, especially, she said, chuckling, the difference between snack and smack. Remember, Asher? Asher nodded ruefully, and the audience laughed aloud. Jonas did too. He remembered, though he had only been 3 at the time himself. The punishment used for small children was a regulated system of smacks with the discipline wand, a thin, flexible weapon that stung painfully when it was wielded. The child care specialists were trained very carefully in the discipline methods. A quick smack across the hands for a bit of minor misbehavior. The 3 sharper smacks on the bare legs for a second offense. Poor Asher, who always talked too fast and mixed up words, even as a toddler. As a 3, eager for his juice and crackers at snack time, he one day said, "Smack," instead of "snack," as he stood waiting in line for the morning treat. Jonas remembered it clearly. He could still see little Asher wiggling with impatience in the line. He remembered the cheerful voice call out, "I want my smack!" The other 3s, including Jonas, had laughed nervously. "Snack," they corrected. "You mean snack, Asher." But the mistake had been made, and precision of language was one of the most important tasks of small children. Asher had asked for a smack. The discipline wand in the hand of the childcare worker whistled as it came down across Asher's hands. Asher whimpered, cringed, and corrected himself instantly. "Snack," he whispered. But the next morning, he had done it again, and again the following week. He couldn't seem to stop, though for each lapse, the discipline wand came again, escalating to a series of painful lashes that left marks on Asher's legs. Eventually, for a period of time, Asher stopped talking altogether when he was a 3. Let me highlight for you again what everyone's reaction is to this memory of violence and pain. The audience laughed aloud. Jonas did too. In a series full of dark moments, this is the one that still chills me the most because of the sheer dissonance between how these people should respond versus how they actually respond. Like I said, it isn't easy to be a kid in the Giver universe, but there's only one scene in this series that makes me want to vomit, and that is the opening scene of the 4th and final book in the Giver series, Sun. Sun opens by taking us back to the community from The Giver. And this time, we are following a girl who, at her ceremony of 12, was chosen to be a birth mother. Here is the opening scene. The young girl cringed when they buckled the eyeless leather mask around the upper half of her face and blinded her. It felt grotesque and unnecessary, but she didn't object. It was the procedure. She knew that. One of the other vessels had described it to her at lunch a month before. "Mask?" she had asked, in surprise, almost chuckling at the strange image. "What's the mask for?" "Well, it's not really a mask." The young woman, seated on her left, corrected herself and took another bite of the crisp salad. "It's a blindfold, actually," she was whispering. They were not supposed to discuss this among themselves. Blindfold? She had asked, in astonishment, then laughed apologetically. I don't seem to be able to converse, do I? I keep repeating what you say, but blindfold? Why? They don't want you to see the product when it comes out of you, when you birth it. The girl pointed to her bulging belly. You've produced already, right? She asked her. The girl nodded. Twice. What's it like? Even asking it, she knew it was a somewhat foolish question. They had had classes, seen diagrams, been given instructions. Still, none of that was the same as hearing it from someone who had already gone through the process. And now that they were already disobeying the restriction about discussing it, well, why not ask? Easier the second time, didn't hurt as much. When she didn't respond, the girl looked at her quizzically. Hasn't anyone told you it hurts? They said discomfort. The other girl gave a sarcastic snort. Discomfort, then, if that's what they want to call it. Not as much discomfort the second time, and it doesn't take as long. Vessels? Vessels? The voice of the matron through the speaker was stern. Monitor your conversations, please. You know the rules. The girl and her companion obediently fell silent then, realizing they had been heard through the microphones embedded in the walls of the dining room. That all seemed such a short time ago. Now here she was, 9 months later, with the blindfold strapped around her eyes. The discomfort had started some hours before, intermittently. Now it was non-stop. She breathed deeply as they had instructed. It was difficult, blinded like this. Her skin was hot inside the mask. She tried to relax, to breathe in and out, to ignore the discomfort. No, she thought, it is pain. It really is pain. Gathering her strength for the job, she groaned slightly, arched her back, and gave herself up to the darkness. Her name was Claire. She was 14 years old. Sun is the last book in the Giver series, and it's also the most epic in scope, spanning over vast distances and many years. It's divided into 3 parts. Book 1, before, Book 2, between, and Book 3, beyond. Book 1, before, takes us back to Jonas's old community and explores what life would have looked like if Jonas had been given basically any other job. The essentially superficial nature of friendships between young adults in the community. And of course, the horrifying realities of birth mothers who are only briefly referenced in The Giver. Claire is the birth mother of Gabriel, the baby boy who finally impels Jonas to escape at the end of The Giver. Normally, birth mothers give birth to 3 children each, and then they never think about or see them again. But through a series of unusual events, Claire finds herself thrown out of her position as birth mother after the birth of her first child, and is instead transferred to the fish hatchery, where she finds herself unable to forget about her baby, her son. She starts volunteering at the nurturing center after work, and miraculously, she does find her son, now a happy toddler named Gabe. And now hopefully the timeline makes sense. Claire is 3 years older than Jonas, and they never meet, obviously, because that's not in The Giver, but Claire does meet Jonas's dad, since he's the one in charge of caring for Gabe. And it's honestly kind of weird to watch Jonas's dad interacting with someone who isn't Jonas or the rest of Jonas's family. It's kind of weird to see him moving around independently outside of his home. It's like seeing your elementary school teacher outside of school. It just feels wrong. Here's a scene where Jonas's dad is talking to Claire. He turned to look behind him at the baby. "Oh, great," he groaned, "eating a leaf. Well, I've been trained to sponge away spit up. Part of the job." Claire could see that he was beginning to shift his balance and move his right foot toward the bike pedal. "Are you allowed to use his name in public now?" she asked quickly, trying to keep them there for another minute or so. "I remember that you were using it secretly." The man hesitated. "Actually," he said, a little guiltily, We do use it at home, but we're not supposed to. He's still just 36 until he's assigned, so I'm afraid I can't tell you what it is. But it's a good one. I'm sure it is. They always choose carefully, don't they? I like your daughter's name. Lily. It's pretty. He smiled. I have to be off now. He's happy now with that leaf to chew, but wait till he wants real food. He'll start yowling, and it's almost mealtime. It was nice to see you, she told him. You too. I'll tell my daughter that you think her name is pretty. She'll love hearing that. He rolled his eyes as if it were too silly for words. And of course, just to be fair and equal, I have to tell you that my son has a nice name as well. Claire laughed. I'm sure he does. The nurturer started off slowly on his bicycle, behind him, strapped into the little seat, his mouth speckled with leaf fragments. The infant looked back and grinned at Claire. It's Jonas, the man called, referring to his son, and pedaled away toward the group of dwellings where he lived. See what I mean? This book is just full of scenes that it feels like we're not supposed to witness. Eventually, of course, Jonas and Gabe escape, and Claire makes an escape of her own. Unfortunately, the boat she escapes in shipwrecks, and Claire washes up on the shore of a small coastal village. Book 2, Between, focuses on Claire's years in this small coastal village as she struggles to remember who she is and how she got there, and also her struggle to fit into this village that is basically what you would get if you crossed Kira's village from Gathering Blue and Maddie's village from Messenger. Life here is simple. They've got agriculture and they've got fishing, and that's pretty much it. Like Maddie's village, the people have a strong sense of community, but unfortunately, like Kira's village, they also turn a blind eye to child abuse and misogyny. It's not the best place to live, but it's also not the worst. It also feels very far removed from the post-apocalyptic reality they're living in, to the point where it feels like the apocalypse happened and they kind of just didn't notice. They're self-sufficient anyway, and yes, there was an apocalypse, but life just kind of kept on going. Honestly, this place is apocalypse goals, but Claire does eventually leave after she remembers her real goal, to find her son, Gabe. She has no idea where he currently is, but she leaves anyway because she is determined to do whatever it takes to find him again. And wouldn't you know it, but immediately after leaving the village, she runs across our old friend, Trademaster, the guy who was handing out gaming machines and undermining democracy in Book 3. He was thrown out of village at the end of Messenger, but now in Book 4, he's back. He was oddly dressed, in a fashion that was unfamiliar to her. Behind the cloak, she could see that he wore a tightly fitted, dark suit with sharp creases in the trousers. On his feet were highly polished shoes of fine leather. There were gloves on his hands, not knitted gloves, such as those she was accustomed to wearing in winter, or the coarse gloves that had helped her grip the rope as she climbed. The man's black gloves were of a thin, silky fabric and molded to fit his slender fingers. Clearly, we have got Mr. Material Girl here. Trademaster, being Trademaster, offers Claire a trade, and Claire says that she wants to find her son. I was told that you could help me. You have been informed correctly, accurately, and precisely. But we must agree on the price to be paid. The trade, do you see? A son in return for... She made her voice as firm as she could. I have nothing. You can see that. I was hoping... To her horror, he reached forward and grasped a thick handful of Claire's long hair. She flinched. What is this then? You have beautiful hair, luxuriant tresses, I would say, sweet smelling despite your ordeal. Do you call this nothing? He put his face into her hair and inhaled. His breath was foul smelling, and Claire willed herself not to step back in disgust. He was twisting the hair he held and hurting her, but she stood her ground. Trademaster is clearly giving off cartoon villain vibes, but Claire wants to find her son so badly that she literally agrees to trade her youth away. The trade happens instantly, and Claire is, well, definitely no longer young. Surprisingly, she found it difficult to walk. Her legs were weak. She couldn't straighten her body easily. She was shuffling and bent, and it was hard to catch her breath. Her hair fell forward over her face, and when she reached up to smooth it back, she saw that her hand had changed, had become veiny and spotted. And she saw that, too, the loosened hair was no longer the thick, red gold curls he had admired a few minutes before. Now it was a sparse handful of coarse gray. He paused, looked back, and smirked at her confusion. "Get a move on, you old hag," he said. Claire is surprised by this development, but unfortunately, that's just what happens when you trade your youth away. True to his word, Trademark does lead the now elderly Claire to Jonas's village. The village from Messenger, where her son Gabe is living, and that leads us into the third and final part of Sun. Book 3, Beyond. Part 7, Evil, or What Is It Good For? The final part of the final book in the Giver series switches perspectives from Claire to her now adolescent son, Gabe. Since Claire sacrificed so much to find Gabe, you would think that she would try to get to know him, but she instead chooses to stalk him, and apparently she's been doing this for years. The old woman appeared frequently. Suddenly, she would be there, standing in the thick pines beside the river, watching him as he worked. Gabe would catch sight of her, would see her dark, homespun clothing, her stooped posture, and the fierce, knowing intimacy of her gaze. But then she would withdraw and disappear into the shaded grove of trees. If he turned away and then looked back, there was no longer a sign of her. Not even a whispering motion in the needled branches she had moved through. She simply went away. Sometimes he thought of calling after her, asking who she was, why she watched him, but for some reason he felt shy. Claire eventually realizes that she's running out of time, that she is dying of old age, and she decides to reveal her identity to Jonas, who is still the leader of village. Jonas then tells Gabe, who doesn't believe him, and to be fair, if someone came up and told me that my birth mother is this old woman who's been stalking me for years, I probably wouldn't believe them either. "I'm sorry, I just don't believe you." Gabe's voice was both skeptical and firm. Jonas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. He cupped his own face with his hands. They were sitting together on the bench behind the library, the same bench where he had sat so recently with Claire. He looked up and sighed. "I felt the same way yesterday when she told it to me. I sat here thinking, this woman is crazy. Is that what you're thinking now of me, Gabe?" Gabe shook his head and looked away. He wanted to be someplace else, off with his lodge mates, building another boat, sinking another boat. He didn't care. Anywhere but here, listening to this unbelievable story being told to him by a man he loved. And last night, this same man had talked of the need to destroy someone. It was scary. It was sad. He turned to Jonas and tried to speak in a soothing voice. "You know what? You've been working awfully hard, probably reading too much. You should take a long walk along the river, have a nice, relaxing, restful..." Aw, Gabe, all grown up and sassing his elders. Jonas eventually convinces Gabe that he is not crazy, that Claire is his mother, and they hurry over to her house. They hurried back to the cottage where Claire was dying. The sun was setting now. Someone had lit an oil lamp on the table. This time, in the flickering golden light, Gabe approached the bed without hesitation. He thought, what he wanted to say, that he'd been waiting all his life for her to find him, that it didn't matter that she was old. What mattered was being together. But when he knelt beside her, he thought he'd come too late. Her eyes were half open and glazed. Her mouth fell slack. Her hand on the coverlet, when he took it in his, was limp and cold. Crying unashamedly, Gabe turned to Jonas, who stood behind him. I wanted to tell her I knew. I wanted to tell her I remember her. But I'm too late, he wept. She's gone. Jonas tells Gabe that she's not quite gone, actually, and if Gabe can track down Trademaster and defeat him, she will be saved. It's time for Jonas to fight for what he loves and to take his place among the pantheon of heroic protagonists in the Giver series. It was dark when Gabe stood at the water's edge, alone. He had begged Jonas to come with him, but Jonas had said no. Years ago, Gabe, when I took you and ran away, there was a man I loved and left behind. I wanted him to come with me, but he said no. He was right to refuse. It was my journey, and I had to do it without help. I had to find my own strengths, face my own fears. And now, you must. Gabe had leaned down and kissed the papery cheek of the silent woman in the bed. There were long pauses between her breaths now, and occasionally a gurgle deep in her throat. Jonas moved his chair so that he could sit close to her. Then he told Gabe where he would find Trademaster, in a grove of birch trees on the far side of the river, and he grasped Gabe's hand. Go, he said. This is your journey, your battle. Be brave. Find your gift. Use it to save what you love. Now, remember, Trademaster can steal your very essence as a person. He can literally steal your youth, and he can do all of this without breaking a sweat. Unsurprisingly, Gabe doesn't stand a chance. The wind howled. The man held Gabe's neck with one gloved hand, raised his weapon with the other, and touched the tender skin there with the blade. Gabe held his breath, afraid that the slightest movement would cause it to slice into his skin. He could feel the exquisite sharpness of the steel. The two of them stood motionless in an embrace that was wrought by hatred. Gabe hoped that his death would be quick. It was the only thing he could hope for now. But instead of just killing Gabe off, Trademaster launches into a dramatic, one might say overly dramatic, villain monologue. You're such a small, unworthy opponent, Trademaster taunted. I've destroyed people far more important than you. Gabe said nothing. He barely breathed. He was motionless, still aware of the blade against his skin. Leaders, whole families. The voice was excited. I've torn them to pieces, left them in whimpering shreds. Gabe felt a sharp sliver of pain, and something trickled from his neck onto his bare shoulder. Trademaster had allowed the razor-sharp blade to make a shallow cut. Wars, the voice went on. I've caused wars. Gabe stood motionless, paralyzed, but sensed that the man wanted a reaction from him, some kind of admiration, perhaps. He stayed silent. I've destroyed whole communities, the man murmured gleefully into Gabe's ear. Do you believe me? Yes, Gabe whispered. But like Jonas, like Kira, Gabe also has a magical superpower, veering, which means that he can veer into other people and feel what they're feeling. So Gabe veers into Trademaster, and surprise, surprise, what he finds is not sunshine and roses. Gabe entered Trademaster. He was sick with searing hatred, and in the endless vortex through which he whirled, there was no comfort. He understood Trademaster and the deep malevolence that inhabited him. It was true, what he had sensed earlier, that Trademaster was inhuman. He was not a man, but simply disguised as one. He was the force of evil for all time. Gabriel floated and spun within the Veer, being part of evil, feeling the anguish and loneliness of it, of having been cast out again and again throughout history, of gathering strength once more, gaining power, weaponry, treachery, cruelty. So Gabe has to fight and defeat the literal incarnation of evil itself. No big deal. I'm sure he can figure it out. And he does, because you cannot end your middle grade / YA series with the triumph of evil. Suddenly, within the simmering wrath and agony of the Veer, Gabe felt hunger. It startled him. Such a small and unimportant feeling. One he had felt himself often as he headed home to dinner. But this, he realized, letting himself go deeper, to feel it completely, was not a yearning for a bowl of soup or a piece of bread. Trademaster was starving. Gabe remembered what Jonas had told him about this kind of evil, that it is fed by its victims. He wants to know how his tragedies play out, Jonas had said. He likes to see how things end. He gloats. It nourishes him. It came to him quickly and was so simple. Those who aren't nourished will die. Those who starve will die. Gabe, as it turns out, doesn't need weapons or magical superpowers to defeat Trademaster. All he needs is empathy and understanding. You remember her, I know. Her name was Claire, Gabe said. She was looking for her little boy. And you know what? She found me, Trademaster. She was willing to give you everything she had, and you took it from her. You took her youth, and her beauty, and her energy, and her health. For a moment, thinking of his mother, Gabe couldn't continue speaking. He fell silent and choked back tears. Then he took a deep breath and went on. It didn't matter. We found each other. None of it mattered but that. You won't ever know what that's like, to love someone. In a way, I pity you, but I hope you starve. Gabe found himself looking down on his enemy, who was hunched over the ground, whimpering. His voice, which had earlier been low and sinuous, now gave a loud, drown-out howl, as if of grief. His eyes were closed, but he groped in the dark for the weapons that had been discarded on the ground. When he touched them, he howled again. At that moment, the moon once more emerged from dissipating clouds, and the wind fell still. In the new light, Gabe could see that the weapons had changed. They were broken toys, bits of rusted tin, as if a careless child had left them out in the rain. Your power is gone, Gabe said. The only response was a moan. As Gabe watched, Trademaster shrank further. Soon he had become a formless, unidentifiable heap of something that smelled of rot. Gabe nudged with his toe at what was left. It had never been human, he knew that. Now it fell away when he touched it with his foot and became nothing. He stared at it for a long time as the night lifted and dawn seeped into the sky. Then he found a sharp rock and dug into the earth until he had made a hole just the right size. He planted his paddle there and banked the damp earth around it so that it stood and marked the place where evil had been vanquished. Then he turned and looked at the river and at the pale wisps of smoke coming from chimneys in the village beyond. It was all of it, familiar and beckoning and safe. He lowered himself into the gently flowing water and swam easily across. Gabe has saved his mother. He has also eradicated evil forever, and they all lived happily ever after. The end. Or did they? Let's take a moment to talk about this ending, what it means versus what it's actually trying to say. First, we need to address the fact that this series has a very serious Jesus complex going on, and to show you what I mean, I'm going to take us back for a moment to book 3. Messenger. Messenger, as we've discussed, is about the struggle to maintain a utopian society against the slippery slope of materialism, and it ends with our protagonist, Maddie, using his magical healing powers to heal village of its materialism. It began with the tiniest sensation. It was different from the larger feelings that still racked his body. The searing agony in his arms and hands, the almost unendurable ulceration of his parched mouth, the feverish pounding of his head. This was a whispered hint of power. He felt it in the tips of his fingers, in the whorls and crevices of his outer skin. It moved across his hands as they lay motionless in the mud. Though he shivered from illness and anguish, he could sense his blood beginning to warm and flow. He lay still. Inside him, the thick, dark liquid slid sinuously through his veins. It entered his heart and throbbed there, moving with purpose through the labyrinth of muscle, collecting energy that came faintly to it from his collapsing lungs. He could feel it surge into his arteries. Within the blood itself, he could perceive its separate cells and see their colors in his consciousness and the prisms of their molecules, and all of it was awake now, gathering power. He could feel his own nerves, each one, millions of them, taut with energy, waiting to be released. The fibers of his muscles tightened. Gasping, Maddie called for his gift to come. There was no sense of how to direct it. He simply clawed, feeling the power in his hands enter, pulsating into the ruined world. He became aware, suddenly, that he had been chosen for this. Maddie groaned and pressed his hands harder into the ground. All of his strength and blood and breath were entering the earth now. His brain and spirit became part of the earth. He rose. He floated above, weightless, watching his human self labor and writhe. He gave himself to it, willingly, traded himself for all that he loved and valued, and felt free. Earlier, I brought up the alternate endings for The Giver that kids have sent to Lois Lowry, and one of the possible endings compared Jonas to Jesus. Jonas was kind of like Jesus because he took the pain for everyone else in the community so they wouldn't have to suffer. And at the very end of the book, when Jonas and Gabe reached the place they knew as Elsewhere, you described Elsewhere as if it were heaven. But this is more appropriate for how Messenger ends, because Maddie is literally Jesus, sacrificing his life to save village. And whichever giver protagonist we're talking about, Jonas, Kira, Maddie, Gabe, there is this incredibly heavy and unfair expectation that is placed on them by the narrative to become the savior, the hero, the Jesus who endures unimaginable suffering to save everyone else. For as much emphasis as the Giver series places on the importance of collaboration and collaborative communities, it's kind of depressing to note how individualistic these endings are. And in particular, I don't really like how Maddie's sacrifice in Messenger gives everyone else in Village an easy out. They're sad that he's dead and they appreciate his sacrifice, but ultimately, they don't have to do any work to become better people. It was an external force that corrupted the people in this utopian little community, and it was an external force that allowed them to return to their former happy lives. Except, of course, the external force that healed them was the sacrifice of a literal child. Thematically, Messenger's ending doesn't make much sense, does it? Messenger is about how the rise of materialism threatens the moral code of their community. And if I asked you to identify the root cause of that problem, you would probably say Trademaster. It's Trademaster's fault. And you would be right, but Trademaster is not forcing people to trade away their deepest selves. These people are deciding that their deepest selves are a worthwhile trade for objectively unimportant items. It's their own choices that turn them into unrecognizable people. So you would think that the lesson would be that when people make bad choices, you can't force them to change. You can guide them towards better choices, but people can only change if they're willing to put in the work to do so. But Messenger seems to be saying that if you sacrifice enough, then you can force people to change, which I think is the wrong lesson to be teaching your young and impressionable readers. If we turn to the ending of Sun and of the series as a whole, there seems to be a similarly limited understanding of human nature. Evil is not an external force that invades human societies and compulsively makes people do bad things, because evil is not intrinsically disconnected from basic human nature. Just as you or I don't like to think that we've intentionally or unintentionally caused pain to other people, evil people don't tend to think of themselves as evil. For example, I might think it's justifiable for me to, refuse to hold an elevator door for someone who has been unkind to me in the past. And similarly, a murderer might think it's justifiable for them to kill someone who has hurt them in the past. A lot of mysteries or thrillers feature people who think they are fundamentally good people and yet end up doing objectively bad things, because people tend to think of themselves as basically good, even after they've made bad choices. I always go back to that scene in BoJack Horseman where BoJack, our chronically depressed and self-destructive protagonist, asks his friend Diana if she believes that he's a good person deep down. She replies that she doesn't believe in deep down, only in who our actions show us to be. But so many people are BoJacks, believing that no matter our actions, deep down, we're still good people, right? But self-perception is only part of the problem. Here's a shower thought for you. How do you define evil? If morality is a sliding scale from angelic to pure evil, what's the difference between an action that is kind of mean and an action that is irredeemably bad? Let's go back to the hypothetical scenario of not holding the elevator door for someone who was previously unkind to you. Is that action morally good, morally bad, or morally neutral? If it is morally bad, how morally bad is it? Does it matter how unkind the person was in the past? Does it matter if the other person is simply late to their barista job, or if they're late to perform a life-saving surgery? If they are late for a life-saving surgery, does it matter if you didn't know that? Morality is incredibly complicated, and real-life situations rarely fit into neat boxes of good versus evil. Some actions, murder, war, genocide, are clearly evil, but the vast majority of everyday interactions between people are arbitrarily good, evil, or somewhere in between, depending on who you ask. And morality evolves. 18th century morality is very different from 21st century morality, and different countries often have completely different moral values. So who's the authority on what's evil and what isn't? Gabe? Jonas? The collective population of Village? And how is this new moral system even going to be enforced? If I try to close the elevator door on someone who is about to perform life-saving surgery, am I going to find myself unable to do it? If I try to close the elevator door on someone who's going to be late for their barista job, am I still going to find myself unable to do it? Or are we all going back to the perpetually content and nice zombie state of Jonas's old community from The Giver? Because I thought that was what we were escaping from in the first place. But this is a series aimed at children. not YouTubers who like to overanalyze books, and maybe at the end of the day, none of this actually matters. Yes, it is unfair to make your child protagonists the Jesus figures who must save their communities. Yes, I personally think that the ending of Messenger sends the wrong, message. And yes, the ending of Sun is overly idealistic and doesn't make much sense if you stop to think about it. But the way the Giver series ends does say something that goes beyond the logic or the theorizing or the rationalizing I have been applying to it. Something that I do think it is important for kids and adults to hear. Throughout the Giver series, our protagonists, Jonas, Kira, Maddie, have been fighting specific issues, specific evils. Jonas fought for feelings, Kira fought for creative freedom, and Maddie fought against materialism. But Gabe, the final protagonist, fights evil itself, not anything specific to his community or his personal situation, and there is both a narrative and a thematic reason for this. On a story level, on a narrative level, it is time for these people to stop fighting against things and to focus instead on building a better world for future generations. There's a lot of nuance in what it means to be good, what it means to have a society that does good things, and how we collectively decide to be good people living in a society that does good things. And now, with the disappearance of evil, Jonas and Kira and Gabe have all the time in the world to figure out the answers. 2, there are a lot of evils in this world, and unfortunately, many of those evils affect children. The Giver series addresses a lot of those evils, but there are also a lot of issues that this series never touches on. When Gabe fights evil itself, readers can insert whatever evil they happen to be struggling with. The message is that whatever you're struggling with, even if it seems as unbeatable as evil itself, you should still stand up to it. Because sometimes, no matter how big or terrifying or abstract the thing you're fighting is, you can face it and win. And honestly, that's not just an important message for kids, but it's also a brilliant way to end the wild ride that is the Giver series. Part 8. Conclusion. The Giver series and its sequels are, as promised, a wild ride, and believe it or not, if you actually read the books, I think you'll find them even more of a wild ride than I've made them seem in this video, because there's a lot of stuff I didn't get into. The sentient piece of wood, the sentient evil forest. Surprisingly, those two things are not connected, and also how Jonas ends up getting married to Kira from Gathering Blue. Speaking of things not included in this video, you might have noticed that we never return to Jonas's community after he leaves. We never learn what happened to the place where it all began. And in her 2018 essay, Ever After, Lois Lowry talks about how this has disappointed many readers. But there had been another question throughout the years. What happened to the community after Jonas and Gabriel were gone? None of the companion books to The Giver had revisited that world. Kids wanted to know whether they, Lily, Fiona, Mother, Father, Asher, all the others, lived happily ever after. I couldn't promise them that. I simply replied to readers. The community changed. Of course it changed. And further on in this essay, she gives us an outline of what change for the community might have looked like. Of course, it would be chaotic. So many changes. So much that would be new and sometimes frightening. The Giver would help them, would teach them. That was, after all, why he had stayed. After a while, I think, the mandatory pills would be discontinued and feelings will return. Feelings are never simple. Picture the adolescents, Jonas's old classmates, as they began to look at each other in new ways. Maybe Asher would suddenly see that another teenager, a girl, appeals to him in some way that he doesn't quite understand. And if she doesn't happen to reciprocate, if she, perhaps, is attracted to a different boy, oh dear, heartbreak would be something new, too. Feelings could be exhilarating. The people would learn this, but they could be heartbreaking as well. And feelings would be expressed, I think, in art. With the return of color, of course, eventually there would be art. And for a while, it would be overwhelming, a world filled with all the things that Jonas and his friends had never known, music, books, and emotions. Would they live happily ever after? Certainly, we want them to. But the frustrating truth is that they can't. No one can. Humans are restless and complicated beings. They fail, often. They fall into despair. Then they pick themselves up and rethink. Everything has to start fresh, sorting itself out, overcoming obstacles, reigniting a new kind of community, a new way of accommodation, because change begets change. Jonas is gone, and color returns, and people have feelings. But when they feel, they will feel it all. Sadness and heartbreak, in addition to love, conflict and anger, in addition to ecstasy. Sides will be taken, things will be sacrificed, people will suffer. That is the way life works when we are human. There is no pleasure without pain, no joy without suffering, and life has not been fully lived until you've experienced every emotional truth it has to offer. Jonas's community blocks out feelings because it's safer that way, but the giver shows us why a life lived in the comfort zone isn't a life worth living. The Giver books are about all the ways that people can hurt each other, but they're also about the magic that happens when someone is brave enough to instigate change, when people come together to create the world that they want to live in. I've said that this series is more interested in ideas than in characters, but maybe it's more accurate to say that it's less interested in individuals and more interested in the ugly, beautiful, complicated mess that is humanity. We make the worst mistakes with the best intentions. We bow down to oppressive systems, and we push entire groups of people to the margins of society. But like Jonas does at the end of The Giver, we also escape oppressive systems. Like Kira does at the end of Gathering Blue, we choose to stay behind and change things. Sometimes, as Maddie does at the end of Messenger, we choose to sacrifice everything for something we believe in. And other times, as Gabe does at the end of Sun, we face down things that feel impossibly bigger and stronger than we are and win. Happily Ever After isn't going to be the ending for my story or yours, but I've always believed in satisfactorily ever after. Satisfactorily ever after as in finding a goal or goals that give you satisfaction and choosing to work towards them so that you can look back on a life well lived. Happiness isn't something we can control or experience on demand, but the satisfaction that comes with knowing you tried, even if you tried and failed, is not something that time or change can take away from you. And I want to close out with this quote from Lois Lowry's Newbery acceptance speech for The Giver. "The man that I named The Giver passed along to the boy knowledge, history, memories, color, pain, laughter, love, and truth. Every time you place a book in the hands of a child, you do the same thing. It is very risky, but each time a child opens a book, he pushes open the gate that separates him from elsewhere. It gives him choices. It gives him freedom. Those are magnificent, wonderfully unsafe things." If you read The Giver as a child, or even if you're just now learning about this series through this video, I hope you'll continue to make risky reading choices as an adult, that you'll choose books that take you elsewhere, that open you up to new choices, new ideas, and new ways of living life to its fullest potential. Maybe I'm biased, but I do truly think that books are among the most powerful creative forces that exist. Books can entertain us, and that's valuable on its own, but books are most powerful when they challenge us, when they educate us, and when they inspire us to make the world a better or happier or brighter place. And that's everything I have to say about the Giver series. This has been the 2 a.m. Book Review Club. Thanks so much for joining me, and I will be back soon with another video. Until then, have a great day and happy book travels!